They once called him the master of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, an obscure Corsican officer who rose from nothing to become emperor of the French, was a man whose ambitions reshaped the world. His victories echoed across continents. His empire stretched from Madrid to Moscow, and for a time, it seemed as though no power could stop him. He was feared, admired, hated, and envied in equal measure. He had dictated the fates of kings, rewritten borders, and placed entire nations at his command. And yet, for all his strength, cunning, and unrelenting willpower, his final battle would not be fought with muskets or cannon fire. It would not be won by strategy, by discipline, or by the loyalty of his soldiers. His last enemy was silent, hidden deep within his own body, and it was an adversary he could neither outmaneuver nor defeat. By 1821, Napoleon was far from the glittering courts of Europe, far from the battlefields where his name had been immortalized. He was trapped on St. Helena, a small, wind-beaten island lost in the middle of the South Atlantic, nearly 2,000 miles from the nearest shore. The British had chosen this island carefully, believing no man could ever escape its isolation. Here, the emperor who had once commanded millions became little more than a prisoner, guarded and contained, a relic of a bygone age. But exile was not what truly destroyed him. His body itself turned traitor, and the man who had once survived war, starvation, and the Russian winter now found himself powerless against an invisible enemy growing within. Witnesses described scenes almost impossible to reconcile with the figure the world once knew. Napoleon Bonaparte, the conqueror of Europe, could be seen doubled over in agony, writhing in his bed as a thick, blackish fluid spilled from his mouth, fluid so dark and granular it resembled coffee grounds. His fingernails turned a ghastly shade of blue. His legs swelled grotesquely until they resembled overfilled sacks of water. When, after his death, the physician cut open his body, the sight inside his stomach was so horrifying that even the seasoned British surgeons, men who had seen countless mangled bodies on the battlefield, stepped back in revulsion. The story most people think they know is far cleaner. Napoleon died in exile, defeated, forgotten on a remote island. That version is neat, almost poetic, the mighty brought low, the emperor undone by the passage of time. But the truth of his last weeks is not poetic. It is brutal. It is disturbing. It is the kind of truth that history prefers to hide, buried away in physician notes and eyewitness accounts, too grotesque for public retelling. Because Napoleon did not fade away quietly. He suffered. He decayed. He begged for simple comforts like sugar water. His mind, fractured by relentless pain, wandered in delirium back to the days when he commanded armies, even as his body was reduced to something less than human. What made his decline even more unbearable was the role of his doctors. The treatments of the early 19th century were not cures, they were punishments. Napoleon was dosed with mercury chloride, a poison in itself. He was bled, purged, blistered, subjected to remedies so violent that today they would be called torture. These men, sworn to heal him, only accelerated his torment. The medicine at times stripped what little strength he had left. His body was failing, but his doctors ensured that the process was cruelly hastened. By March of 1821, Napoleon could no longer rise from his bed without help. Think of the contrast. 6 years earlier, he had staged one of the greatest comebacks in history. He had escaped from exile on Elba with barely 1,000 men, marched across France, and reclaimed his throne without firing a single shot. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead cast down their weapons and joined him, swept up once again by his aura of command. Now that same man could not even keep down a glass of water. His decline revealed itself in unexpected ways. The bath that had once been a daily routine became an obsession, almost a ritual of survival. His loyal valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, watched as Napoleon spent entire afternoons submerged in a copper tub. The water was boiling hot, so hot it turned his skin lobster red, yet he demanded more and more scalding water whenever it cooled. He stayed there for 6 hours, sometimes 8, gripping the sides of the tub with white knuckles, his body pruning and peeling, his skin blistering. Why? Because the bath was the only place where the fire in his stomach seemed to calm, the only refuge from the relentless pain tearing through him. Outside that copper sanctuary, every movement felt like a blade twisting in his gut. Food became impossible. Napoleon, who had always eaten with the efficiency of a soldier, treating meals as nothing more than fuel, now could not stomach even the scent of bread. The very smell of it made him gag. Inside his body, a tumor had grown, a malignant carcinoma buried deep in his stomach lining. It was not a small growth. It was the size of a fist, stretching over 4 inches long, curling itself like a parasite around his stomach. Every heartbeat drove blood into that diseased mass. Every breath pressed it harder against his other organs. It was as if something monstrous had taken root inside him, devouring him cell by cell, while he sat helpless, boiling himself in the bathtub to dull the agony. By April, his transformation shocked even his closest companions. Count Montholin, who had remained by his side since the disaster at Waterloo, looked upon his master and could barely hide his dismay. Napoleon's arms, once thick with muscle, once strong enough to shift cannon wheels by hand, had shriveled into thin bones covered with sagging skin. His biceps were so wasted that one could wrap a thumb and forefinger around them with ease. And yet his stomach told a different story. It swelled grotesquely, distended with fluid until he resembled a man in the late stages of pregnancy. He had become a skeleton with a grotesque balloon for a belly. On the rare occasions he attempted to walk, the sight was heartbreaking. He leaned backward unnaturally, forced to counterbalance the massive weight of his distended abdomen. Each step was clumsy, strained, almost inhuman. And then there was the smell. Those who entered his chambers never forgot it. It was not simply the odor of sweat or sickness. It was something far worse. It was the cloying, sickly sweet stench of necrosis, tissue rotting inside a man still alive. His servants tried desperately to mask it. They burned sulfur, they lit sticks of incense, they sealed the windows shut because the doctors insisted fresh air would worsen his state. The result was an atmosphere so dense, so suffocating, that one could almost taste the sickness in the air. And so, this was how Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once crowned himself emperor, who dictated the destiny of Europe, who redefined the very meaning of power, spent his last days. Not astride a horse at the head of his army, not in quiet dignity, reflecting on his life, but trapped in a failing body, consumed by a cancer that devoured him from within and tormented by the very treatments that were supposed to save him. His final battle was not glorious. It was not heroic. It was a slow, rotting agony. The master of Europe, reduced to something his loyal followers could barely recognize as human. April 15th, Palm Sunday. The air in Longwood House hung heavy, thick with sickness and silence, as Napoleon Bonaparte lay in his bed. Once, this man had been the thunder of Europe, the master of armies, the nightmare of kings. Now he was reduced to a dying figure surrounded by whispers and fading candlelight. That morning, he summoned Abbé Venali, a priest. The irony was striking. Here was the man who had crowned himself emperor, who had bent the church to his will, who had imprisoned the Pope itself, now calling for the last rites of the very faith he had manipulated for power. His words were quiet, almost conversational, as though he were simply making an observation about the weather. I know I'm dying. There is no fear in the tone, no melodrama, only a blunt acceptance. Yet even in that moment of mortality, the fire of his ego burned, refusing to go out. In the rare hours when his mind was clear, Napoleon directed his final campaign, not on the battlefield but in ink. With the same precision he once used to orchestrate marches and maneuvers, he dictated his will. Nothing was left to chance. Every word, every clause, was calculated for effect. Even in death, he wanted his enemies to feel the sting of his presence. 10,000 francs he left to Cantillon, the man who had once tried to assassinate Wellington. A gesture designed not only as a jab at his great rival, but as a statement. Napoleon was still firing shots, still fighting wars that had long since been lost. His body might have been crumbling, but his pride was untouchable. The doctors, however, had no pride left to offer him. What they offered instead was cruelty disguised as medicine. His British physician, Dr. Archibald Arnott, armed with the flawed knowledge of the early 19th century, turned to remedies that today would be called torture. When a cancerous tumor choking Napoleon's intestines left him unable to pass waste, Arnott prescribed calomel, 10 grains of mercury chloride. Mercury, a poison being fed into the stomach of a man whose insides were already dissolving. The effect was immediate and grotesque. Bertrand, one of his most loyal aides, later described what happened. Napoleon passed the largest stool he had produced in weeks, black as tar and reeking of rot and blood. It was not relief. It was evidence of catastrophic internal bleeding, of organs breaking down under the strain. Yet Arnott, blind in his conviction, saw it as progress. He ordered another dose, as though pushing the emperor deeper into misery was the path to recovery. By April 28th, the end had begun in earnest. Napoleon's mind, the sharpest weapon he had ever wielded, the mind that had reconfigured maps and humbled nations, began to fracture. But it did not fade quietly into nothing. It raged with terrifying brilliance. His hallucinations were not vague mutterings. They were full campaigns. He bolted upright in his bed, skeletal arms trembling but commanding, as he directed invisible regiments across a battlefield only he could see. He shouted for cavalry, demanded artillery fire, sent in the guard with urgency. His voice, once the voice of command over millions, now echoed in a small bedroom on a remote island. Austerlitz was alive again in his mind, though the Austrians he fought had been dead for 15 years. Montholon, his faithful companion, wept openly at the sight. The emperor was not simply dying. He was trapped in his own past, replaying victories while his body failed him in humiliating ways. The man who had once crossed Europe without fear could no longer control his bowels. And yet his mind reached beyond the walls of Longwood House, sometimes calling for Josephine, his lost love, gone 7 years, sometimes begging for water, reliving the brutal thirst of the Egyptian deserts 2 decades earlier, even as his body drowned in its own failing fluids. Then came May 1st, and with it, a moment of horror that would haunt his attendants forever. Napoleon, still clinging to the dignity of his title, demanded to walk. Emperors, he insisted, did not rot in bed. 2 servants lifted him, supporting his wasted frame. He managed 3 staggering steps. On the 4th, his legs gave way. His stomach convulsed so violently that all in the room believed he would die then and there. But before he could hit the floor, Ali, his faithful servant who had been with him since the pyramids of Egypt, caught him in his arms. The emperor, broken and gasping, still clawed upward, still tried to rise. "My army," he rasped. "Where's my army?" For grown men were forced to restrain him, holding him down as he thrashed and struggled to review troops that existed only in the battlefield of his mind. The doctors were not finished with him. Believing that harsher measures might draw the sickness out, they turned to blistering plasters. These were patches soaked in crushed beetles designed to burn the flesh, the theory being that external agony might cure internal disease. They applied them to his chest, his legs, his feet. Soon, Napoleon's skin, already jaundiced and yellow from liver failure, broke into angry welts. Blisters oozed with clear fluid. His body was being seared alive from the outside, while cancer hollowed him from within. And then came May 3rd, the day when medicine crossed the final threshold into barbarity. The doctors gave him 20 grains of calomel. 20, a dose strong enough to poison a healthy man outright. But they did not stop there. To force the poison through his system, they followed it with an enema so violent it shattered the last fragments of Napoleon's dignity. The sound that filled Longwood House was not the roar of a general, not the steady voice of command. It was a scream, high, raw, and desperate. A scream not born from pain, but from humiliation. The man who had once stood unfazed under grape-shot fire, who had reshaped Europe with his will, was now pinned to a bed while strangers forced mercury-laced water into his failing body. When it was over, he turned away from them, pressing his face to the wall. For hours he would not look at anyone. The silence in the room was unbearable. His attendants saw the truth written across his body. The emperor was no longer Napoleon, no longer the figure who had bent the continent to his will. He was a dying man, humiliated, broken, and rotting before their eyes. The treatments triggered a final cascade of horrors. His body expelled stool after stool, each darker and fouler than the last. But then came something more terrifying. Mixed in with the black waste were fragments of tissue, pieces of his stomach lining. Napoleon's insides, ravaged by cancer, were now literally falling out of him. His body was disintegrating from within, every moment stripping away what remained of the man who had once ruled from Madrid to Moscow. On the morning of May 4th, just before dawn, the final unraveling of Napoleon Bonaparte began. His body, already battered by years of illness and crude medical treatments, suddenly betrayed him in a way that horrified those gathered at his bedside. The mercury compounds he had been given, intended as a cure, had instead turned lethal. He began to vomit with such violence that the strain burst the blood vessels in his eyes, staining the whites crimson. The sight was terrifying. Those who had once seen him command men on the battlefield, cold and unshakable, now watched him thrash in helpless convulsions. What came out his mouth was no longer simply blood. Bertrand, one of his closest companions, swore that he saw pieces of flesh, fragments of Napoleon's own stomach lining, pushed out by the spasms. His body was literally consuming itself, tearing apart from within. And still, even between fits of agony, Napoleon tried to form words. His voice was choked, broken, bubbling through blood, yet fragments emerged. France, Maurice, LME. In those garbled syllables were his last obsessions. His homeland, his son, and the army that had once carried him across Europe. Even as death dissolved him, his mind clung to the identity that had defined him. The atmosphere in the room was unbearable. It was not the ordinary odor of sickness. It was something worse, thick, heavy, suffocating. Witnesses described it as the smell of decomposition itself, the odor of a body beginning to rot even while it still clung to life. The tumor that had consumed his stomach had finally perforated the wall, leaving a gaping wound inside him. What kept him alive was not medicine or willpower, but a grotesque quirk of fate. Scar tissue had bound his stomach to his liver, forming a kind of natural patch. Without it, his stomach contents would have poured into his abdomen, killing him in a matter of hours. Instead, he lingered, technically alive, though with a hole in his stomach so large that one could slip a finger straight through it. It was a cruel mercy, stretching his suffering across hours rather than minutes. By May 5th, at 3 a.m, Napoleon slipped into what physicians today call the death spiral. His breathing became a dreadful rhythm. Shane, Stokes' respiration, sharp, shallow gasps followed by long silences, as though his brain had forgotten how to keep him alive. His chest rose and fell, then stilled, then convulsed again. Each pause grew longer, each gasp weaker, the cycle of life stuttering toward its end. Between the groans of his collapsing digestive system, he managed a few final words. Yet even here, history fractures. Montalon swore he heard France, army, Josephine. Marchand insisted it was France. My son, my soul. Bertrand, ever dutiful, recorded head of the army. Each man heard something different, something that reflected his own bond to the emperor. Perhaps each clung to what he wanted to hear. Or perhaps Napoleon, even in delirium, spoke to them all, scattering fragments of himself into the ears of those who had followed him into exile. By 5:30 that morning, his throat swelled shut. No words could pass, no orders, no cries. He could not scream, could not command. He could only produce guttural, animal-like sounds, noises dredged from the depths of his chest. The eyes that had once bent nations to his will, those gray, unblinking eyes that made kings tremble, were now fixed beyond the walls of that stifling room. He stared not at the faces of servants or doctors, but at something no one else could see, perhaps visions conjured by delirium, perhaps ghosts of memory, or perhaps, as some whispered, the legions of dead soldiers who had marched with him across Europe. The bedroom itself became a grotesque parody of his old court. 16 people crowded inside, surrounding the bed as though awaiting commands. But there were no commands to give, no decrees to sign, only the spectacle of his body breaking down hour by hour. Dr. Arnott, desperate to ease or perhaps revive him, pressed bottles of scalding hot water against his bloated stomach. The reaction was immediate and horrifying. Napoleon's back arched violently, his mouth opened in a silent scream. His throat, swollen nearly shut, allowed no sound to escape, so he writhed in noiseless torment. When that failed, they tried one final intervention, one final cruelty. Mustard poultices strapped to his feet, the acrid fumes intended to shock his system back into life. The room filled with the biting stench of mustard mixed with the stench of decay. Even hardened doctors gagged, struggling to remain at their posts. His skin displayed every stage of dying. Where the jaundice painted him yellow, burns from crude treatments flared red. In other places, oxygen starvation turned him mottled purple. The emperor who had once embodied vitality and fire was reduced to a grotesque canvas of suffering, his flesh a map of disease and torment. Finally, at 5:49 in the evening of May 5th, after 17 hours of slow-motion agony, the body that had marched across Europe ceased to breathe. There was no grand farewell, no defiant proclamation, no last gesture of command. The man who had once bent the continent to his will simply stopped. The autopsy that followed revealed horrors even greater than his death. When the surgeons cut into him, the stench of cancer filled the room with such force that several physicians fled, gagging. His stomach was no longer flesh, but leather, its walls almost entirely consumed by cancer. The perforation was exactly where his doctors had predicted, near the pylorus, and Dr. Anamarchi demonstrated it by slipping his finger straight through. Worse still, small white nodules dotted his intestines, metastatic pearls strung across his inner organs. He had been dying for years, even as he dictated memoirs, dreamed of escape, and whispered of return. His body had been betraying him cell by cell, long before the end arrived. Officially, his stomach and heart were sealed in silver vessels to be buried with him. Unofficially, the surgeons scavenged. Dr. Anamarchi clipped pieces of his rib as keepsakes. Locks of hair were stolen and sold. And infamously, one doctor allegedly removed Napoleon's penis, smuggling it away, where it eventually surfaced in the collection of an American urologist, shriveled and leathery, described as resembling a shoelace. The conqueror who once dictated the fate of nations was reduced to fragments and curiosities. What remained of his body was dressed in the green uniform he had loved, his bicorn hat placed solemnly at his feet. But the story of his corpse did not end with burial. 19 years later, in 1840, his remains were exhumed for return to France. When the coffin was opened, those present expected bones and dust, the natural remains of time. Instead, they saw the impossible. Napoleon lay perfectly preserved, his features intact, his skin pale as marble, his uniform unspoiled. It looked as though he had been laid to rest yesterday, not nearly 2 decades earlier. The sight was so uncanny that it sparked endless theories. Some claimed the arsenic in his body had acted as a preservative. Others whispered of secret embalming performed in defiance of British orders. Still others suggested it was one last enigma, a final mystery in a life already filled with him. The horror of Napoleon's death was not just in the cancer, or the mercury, or the brutal tortures passed off as treatment. It was in the complete undoing of everything he had once been. The brilliant strategist fell into delirium. The iron will crumbled into helpless groans. The body that had once crossed mountains and shattered empires decayed from the inside, rotting while it still drew breath. His last clear words were not of power or glory, but of France and his army, a final cry of a soldier rather than an emperor. In the end, the man who had made Europe tremble died, trembling himself, not from fear, but from the uncontrollable spasms of a body eating itself alive. Today, visitors stand in awe at Les Invalides in Paris, gazing at the grand red sarcophagus that enshrines him. They see the monument, the legacy, the glory carved in stone. But within that tomb lies a man who died vomiting pieces of his own stomach, a man whose body was so destroyed that even hardened doctors turn away in disgust. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had toppled kingdoms, crowned himself emperor, and rewritten the map of Europe, could not defeat the cancer that consumed him from within. And his final lesson is one that outlives all his victories and defeats. Death does not care about glory. Death strips away crowns, titles, and illusions. It comes for all, in pain, in filth, and solitude. Even the mightiest conquerors learn the same truth. In the end, we all die badly, and we all die alone.